In 1851, a Southern widow invited a slave into her home, and unknowingly set in motion events that would forever rewrite her bloodline. What began as a desperate bid for survival would evolve into a forbidden connection that defied the most rigid social order in America. Their dangerous choice wouldn't just cost them everything they knew, it would create a bloodline that wasn't supposed to exist, and the consequences would echo through generations. Eleanor Montgomery never expected to become the mistress of Willowbrook Plantation at 23. When her husband Thomas collapsed at dinner, the life she knew died with him. A woman cannot run a plantation, her brother-in-law William declared, eyeing the 200 acres and 40 enslaved people with barely concealed greed. You must sell to me or find another husband before summer's end. But Eleanor had seen how William treated his own workers, with a cruelty that made even hardened overseers wince, and she had watched her mother wither away in a second marriage that was nothing but a prison of politeness. "I would rather burn this house to the ground," she whispered to her lady's maid that night as she clutched Thomas's ledgers to her chest. The numbers swam before her eyes. Debts mounting, cotton yields falling, and not nearly enough knowledge to save any of it. What Eleanor didn't reveal was the terror that gripped her each night, that she would fail, that the bank would take everything, that the people whose labor built this wealth would suffer even more under William's ownership. But Eleanor's bold choice would soon be tested by a crisis that would force her to cross a boundary no Southern lady dared approach. The fever came with the summer rains. First, it claimed 3 children in the quarters, then an elderly man who had survived 40 years of bondage. By the time it reached the 5th victim, panic had settled over Willowbrook like a shroud. "It's the water," whispered Martha, Eleanor's house servant, eyes wide with fear. "Something evil's got into the well." Eleanor sent for Dr. Harwood from town, but his response was swift and cutting. "I don't treat slaves during epidemic season, Mrs. Montgomery. Too much risk of carrying disease to my respectable patients." When Eleanor pressed, mentioning payment, his reply chilled her. "Perhaps if you had a husband to insist, madam." That night, Eleanor woke drenched in sweat, her nightgown clinging to her body like a second skin. The room spun violently when she tried to stand. By morning, she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Martha tended to her with cool cloths and prayers, but Eleanor could see the truth in her servant's eyes. This was the same fever that had already claimed 5 lives. "Fetch William," Eleanor whispered, knowing that even her detested brother-in-law wouldn't let her die without a doctor. But William was in Charleston on business, and Dr. Harwood still refused to come. On the 3rd day, when Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps and her skin burned like fire, Martha made a decision that would change everything. "There's someone who can help," she said, her voice barely audible. "But Mrs., you gotta understand, he ain't supposed to know what he knows." Through the haze of fever, Eleanor nodded. That night, a tall figure slipped into her bedroom. Through half-closed eyes, Eleanor saw a black man with steady hands and eyes that held no fear, only determination. "My name is Isaiah," he said simply, placing herbs into a steaming bowl, "and I'm going to save your life." Eleanor's life was saved, but what awaited her upon awakening would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world she inhabited. Isaiah belonged to the neighboring Caldwell plantation, where he served as both field hand and secret healer. His knowledge, passed down through generations from his West African ancestors, was both his gift and his danger. The Caldwell plantation was known for its harsh treatment of slaves, making Isaiah's clandestine movements even more perilous. Each night he risked lashings or worse to cross the property line that separated the 2 estates. "If Master Caldwell knew I was treating white folk," Isaiah explained as he changed Eleanor's poultice, his fingers working with the delicate precision of a surgeon, "he'd sell me downriver faster than you can blink. New Orleans traders paid double for men my size. No questions asked about why we're being sold." The lamplight cast shadows across his face. revealing scars that told stories Eleanor dared not ask about. His hands, though calloused from cotton fields, moved with an artist's grace as he applied the mixture of crushed herbs and roots to her feverish skin. For 3 days, Isaiah came by night, slipping through the shadows to tend to Eleanor. His hands worked with practiced precision, mixing tinctures and brewing teas that smelled of earth and mystery. The bitter concoctions made Eleanor grimace, but Isaiah would stand patiently by her bedside, arms folded, until she drained each cup. "My grandmother would say medicine that tastes sweet rarely cures," he remarked with the hint of a smile when Eleanor complained. It was the first time she had seen any lightness cross his otherwise guarded expression. Under his care, Eleanor's fever broke, and strength gradually returned to her limbs. By the 4th day, she could sit upright without the room spinning, and the angry red rash that had spread across her chest began to fade to a dull pink. "Why risk it?" Eleanor asked on the 4th night when she could finally sit up in bed. The question had been burning in her mind since she'd regained enough clarity to understand the danger of their arrangement. "Why help me at all? If you were caught—" Isaiah's eyes met hers, unflinching. In them, Eleanor saw something she had never noticed in any of her own slaves, a fierce intelligence undiminished by years of bondage. "Because I took an oath to my grandmother before she died, to heal whoever needs healing, no matter their color. She believed sickness doesn't care about skin, so neither should the cure." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because Martha begged me, said you weren't like most mistresses." Eleanor had never been looked at so directly by any black person. The experience unsettled her, not with fear, but with the sudden, uncomfortable awareness of her own humanity reflected back at her. All her life, she had been taught that the eyes of slaves should be downcast, their gazes deferential. Isaiah's steady gaze challenged everything she had been raised to believe about the natural order of things. As Isaiah prepared to leave, gathering his small cloth bundle of remedies, Eleanor impulsively caught his wrist. His skin felt warm beneath her fingers, and she withdrew her hand as if burned, suddenly conscious of the impropriety of her action. "The sickness in the quarters," she said, trying to mask her confusion at her own behavior. "Could you—" "Already tending to them," he replied, tucking the bundle inside his worn jacket. "Your Martha's been smuggling me in for 2 weeks now. 3 children are recovering, and we've lost no one else since I started treating them." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. While she had lain helpless, an entire shadow network had operated beneath her notice. Black hands helping black bodies, with one white servant as accomplice. The plantation she thought she governed had an entire life she knew nothing about. "I'll pay you," Eleanor offered, the words awkward on her tongue. How did one compensate an enslaved person who wasn't yours? Would the money even stay in his possession? Or would Caldwell take it? "For the medicine, for the risk." Isaiah's smile held no humor. "Keep your money, Mrs. Montgomery. Just don't tell anyone I was here." He hesitated, then added, "Though if you truly wish to help, your people need better water. The well near the quarters is fouled. That's where the sickness started." Eleanor nodded, making a mental note to have the well cleaned or a new one dug. It was the least she could do, though the thought of how easily she could have prevented suffering made shame curl in her stomach. "Tomorrow night will be my last visit," Isaiah said, moving toward the servants' entrance that connected to the back stairs. "You're healing well now. The danger has passed." Eleanor felt an unexpected pang at his words. In her feverish state, his presence had become a comfort. The steady hands, the quiet voice explaining each treatment, the knowledge that someone who truly understood healing was watching over her. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling wholly inadequate. "I won't forget this." "Best that you do, Mrs. Montgomery," Isaiah replied softly. "Remembering can be dangerous for both of us." But as Isaiah turned to leave, his hand reaching for the door handle, the bedroom door swung open from the main hallway. Framed in the doorway stood William Montgomery, returned early from Charleston, his face contorting from confusion to rage as he took in the scene before him. His sister-in-law in her night clothes, a black man standing in her private chambers, the evidence of treatment scattered across her bedside table. "What in God's name?" he thundered, reaching for the pistol at his belt, his face flushing crimson with fury, "is happening here?" Eleanor's heart seized in her chest. Behind William stood his personal manservant, eyes wide with shock, and beyond him, 2 plantation overseers who had accompanied William from town. 4 witnesses to what would surely be seen as the ultimate transgression, a black man in a white woman's bedroom after dark. Isaiah froze, his body tensing like a cornered animal. Eleanor saw his eyes dart to the window, calculating the distance, the fall, the chance of escape. "William," Eleanor began, her voice steadier than she felt, knowing that what she said next might determine whether Isaiah lived or died. "I can explain." But William was already raising his pistol, his eyes wild with a fury that seemed to transcend mere outrage at a social boundary crossed. This was the rage of a man who saw his entire world order threatened. "Step away from her," he snarled at Isaiah, cocking the hammer with a click that echoed in the suddenly silent room. "Or I swear to God I'll shoot you where you stand." "William, lower your weapon," Eleanor commanded, summoning every ounce of authority she could muster despite her weakened state. Her voice carried the steel of generations of Montgomery women who had managed households through war, famine, and pestilence. "This man saved my life when your precious Dr. Harwood refused to come." William's hand trembled slightly, but the pistol remained aimed at Isaiah's chest. The lamplight caught the polished metal, making it gleam with deadly promise. "You expect me to believe that? A slave in your bedchamber at night? The scandal alone would ruin this family's name forever. Have you lost your senses entirely, Eleanor?" "He's a healer," Eleanor insisted, forcing herself to stand despite the room's spinning. She gripped the bedpost for support, her knuckles white with the effort. The floorboards felt unsteady beneath her bare feet, but she refused to show weakness. "The fever that took 5 of our people nearly took me too. Isaiah has knowledge that our white doctors lack. Knowledge that saved my life when your Charleston physician was too concerned with propriety to dirty his hands with our troubles." William's eyes narrowed, suspicion warring with confusion. His gaze darted between Eleanor and Isaiah, who stood perfectly still, his eyes now downcast in the pose of submission expected of him. "And how exactly did you come to know this healer? How did a slave from another plantation gain access to my brother's widow's bedchamber?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Behind William, his manservant and the overseers exchanged glances, already imagining the gossip they would spread if given the chance. Martha stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, her usually stoic face etched with fear. She had been listening from the servants' passage, ready to intervene if needed. "It was me, Master William. I brought him here when Mrs. was dying. Dr. Harwood wouldn't come, said he was too busy with his important patients in town, said he'd come when it was convenient." Her voice trembled but held firm. "I couldn't watch my mistress die without trying something." Eleanor saw the calculation in William's eyes, the weighing of propriety against practicality, of racial boundaries against family reputation. A dead sister-in-law would raise questions. A scandal would be worse. The Montgomery name had weathered many storms, but even it might not survive the whispers that would follow if word spread that Thomas Montgomery's widow had entertained a male slave in her bedchamber. If word got out that Thomas Montgomery's widow died of the same fever as her slaves, Eleanor pressed, seeing her advantage, what would Charleston society say? That the mighty Montgomerys couldn't even afford proper medical care? That you, as head of the family now, couldn't secure treatment for your brother's wife? She watched the barb strike home. William's position in Charleston society was precarious, new money trying to establish itself among old. The Montgomery fortune came from cotton and banking, not the centuries of plantation aristocracy that the oldest families boasted. A scandal or suggestion of financial trouble could undo years of careful social climbing. William's jaw clenched. A vein pulsed at his temple. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the pistol, though his finger remained near the trigger. The tension in the room eased fractionally, though Isaiah remained as still as a statue. "You," he barked at Isaiah. "Who owns you?" "Caldwell Plantation, sir," Isaiah answered, his voice carefully neutral, eyes downcast in the pose of subservience that Eleanor now recognized as a performance. She noticed how he modulated his tone, intelligent enough to answer clearly, but not so articulate as to raise suspicion. William turned to one of the overseers, a burly man with a perpetually sunburned face whom Eleanor knew to be particularly harsh with the field hands. "Jenkins, escort this healer back to Caldwell's property. Say nothing of where you found him. As far as anyone knows, he was caught wandering after curfew. I'll deal with Caldwell myself if questions arise." "And Isaiah," Eleanor interjected, her heart pounding with fear for the man who had saved her. "He will not be punished for saving my life. I insist on that, William." William's laugh was cold, echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "You presume to dictate terms now, Eleanor? Remember your position. You're a widow with debts, not the mistress of this estate by right. Thomas left you. Comfortable. But Willowbrook's management falls to me until his son comes of age." "No," Eleanor agreed, meeting her brother-in-law's gaze steadily. "But I am still the legal owner until I choose to sell or remarry. And I have friends in Charleston who would be most interested to hear how you threatened a man who saved my life, particularly when that man belongs to Caldwell, whose support you need for your banking ventures." It was a bluff. Eleanor had no such friends, no such influence. But William couldn't know that. She saw uncertainty flicker across his face. The Montgomery-Caldwell connection was indeed vital to William's newest financial endeavor, a cotton exchange that required the cooperation of several large plantation owners. "Take him back," William finally ordered Jenkins, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "No harm comes to him. Tonight, but ensure Caldwell knows his slave was found on Montgomery land after curfew. Let him deal with the discipline as he sees fit." Jenkins nodded, moving toward Isaiah with a rough gesture. "Come on then, let's go." "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than intended. All eyes turned to her. More softly, she added, "Let him gather his medicines. They're his master's property, after all." William gave a curt nod, and Isaiah carefully collected his small bundle of remedies, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the tension crackling in the air. "But Eleanor," William added, turning back to her with cold fury once Isaiah had his belongings, "this matter is far from settled. We will speak in the morning when you're decent. This behavior cannot stand, fever or no fever." The threat in his words was unmistakable. As the men filed out, William last among them, he cast one final, assessing look at Eleanor that chilled her to the bone. It was the look of a man recalculating his strategy, seeing an opponent where he had previously seen only an inconvenient female relative. After they departed, Martha rushed to Eleanor's side as her legs gave way. The strength that had sustained her during the confrontation evaporated, leaving her trembling and weak. "Mrs., that was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," Martha whispered, helping her back to bed. Her hands were gentle, but her expression troubled as she tucked the covers around Eleanor. "Master William doesn't forget slights, and he doesn't forgive them either." Eleanor's hands trembled as reaction set in. The full magnitude of what had just occurred, and what might yet happen, crashed over her like a wave. "Will Isaiah be safe?" Martha's expression was grim as she busied herself rebuilding the fire that had died down during the confrontation. "For tonight, maybe. Jenkins isn't the worst of the overseers. But Master William won't forget this, and neither will Caldwell when he hears some version of this story." Caldwell, Eleanor murmured, remembering what she knew of the neighboring plantation owner. Richard. Caldwell was older than William, established in a way the Montgomerys were still striving to be. His plantation adjoined Willowbrook to the east, twice the size with 3 times the enslaved workforce. He was known to be harsh but pragmatic. What will he do to Isaiah? Martha's silence was answer enough. The punishment for a slave caught on another plantation after dark, regardless of the reason, could range from whipping to much worse, especially for a man like Isaiah who already walked a dangerous line with his healing knowledge. "Then we must act quickly," Eleanor said, mind racing despite her exhaustion. The fever had left her body weak, but her thoughts were clearer than they had been in days. "Before dawn, I need you to take a message to Caldwell Plantation." "To Isaiah?" Martha asked, surprise evident in her voice. "No," Eleanor replied, a plan forming even as she spoke. "To Mrs. Caldwell." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Caldwell? But Mrs. she hardly ever receives visitors. They say she's sickly, keeps to herself except for church on Sundays." "Exactly," Eleanor said, a grim smile touching her lips. "A sickly woman who might value a healer's skills, and a woman who might influence her husband in ways William would never anticipate." Martha studied her mistress with new eyes. "You're planning something." "I'm ensuring survival," Eleanor corrected. "Mine and Isaiah's. Now, help me write this note. It must reach Mrs. Caldwell before her husband hears William's version of events." As Martha fetched paper and ink, Eleanor stared into the dancing flames of the newly stoked fire. Thomas had often told her she was too soft-hearted for plantation life, too concerned with the welfare of their slaves, too willing to see them as people rather than property. He had indulged what he called her feminine sensibilities, with fond exasperation. But Thomas had never seen her like this, calculating, strategic, willing to use every advantage. Perhaps this was what widowhood had given her, not just grief, but a cold clarity about what she must do to survive in a world that offered women few choices and less power. The next morning, Eleanor dressed with particular care, selecting a somber black dress that emphasized her widow's status. The high collar and modest cut spoke of propriety and mourning, while the quality of the fabric reminded anyone who saw her that she was still a Montgomery by marriage. She arranged her hair simply but elegantly, and though her face remained pale from illness, she pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them. William was waiting in Thomas's study, deliberately choosing the room that most emphasized the Montgomery legacy Eleanor had married into. The massive oak desk where Thomas had conducted business for 15 years dominated the space. Behind it, portraits of Montgomery men gazed sternly down, their eyes seeming to follow Eleanor as she entered. William himself sat in Thomas's chair, another calculated move. He didn't stand when Eleanor entered, merely gestured to the smaller chair across the desk, the supplicant's position. "Your behavior last night was unconscionable," William began without preamble, his fingers steepled before him. "If word spreads of a slave in your bedchamber, alone, at night, do you understand what people would think? What they would say about you? About the Montgomery name?" "It won't," Eleanor interrupted, her voice calm as she placed a folded piece of paper on the desk between them, "because Mrs. Caldwell has agreed to my proposal." William blinked, momentarily thrown off his prepared lecture. "What proposal? What have you done, Eleanor?" "I've purchased Isaiah's contract," Eleanor stated calmly, watching with carefully concealed satisfaction as surprise registered on William's face. "As of this morning, he belongs to Willowbrook." "You did what?" William sputtered, snatching up the paper. His eyes scanned the document with increasing disbelief. "Without consulting me, without permission, have you taken leave of your senses entirely?" "I used my personal inheritance from my father," Eleanor continued, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. The gambit had cost her nearly everything, but William didn't need to know that. Mrs. Caldwell was quite amenable when I explained that Isaiah's medical knowledge could help contain the fever that might otherwise spread to her plantation next. She convinced her husband that selling one slave was preferable to risking an epidemic. William's face darkened as he scanned the document more carefully. This is madness. A waste of good money on damaged goods. After last night, this slave is ruined. He'll fill the others' heads with ideas above their station. And Caldwell charged you double what this man is worth. His name is Isaiah, Eleanor corrected quietly but firmly. And he will serve as our plantation healer. The fever is contained, our workers are recovering, and production will resume faster than if we'd lost more people. I'd call that a sound investment, not madness. She delivered these points as Thomas would have, in terms of business and profit. It was the only language William respected, and she had spent the sleepless hours of the night rehearsing this argument. "You overpaid," William finally said, tossing the paper back onto the desk with ill-disguised contempt. "Caldwell saw you coming, took advantage of a hysterical woman's gratitude." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded, refusing to rise to the bait. "But I considered it an investment in Willowbrook's future, and it solves your problem as well, William. No scandal, no awkward questions about why Dr. Harwood refused to treat your brother's widow, no rumors about the Montgomery finances being insufficient to secure proper medical care." William studied her with new wariness, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. The soft-spoken, deferential sister-in-law who had always yielded to Thomas's judgment and, by extension, his brother's, had vanished. In her place sat a woman with steel in her spine and calculation in her eyes. "You've changed, Eleanor. Thomas's death has hardened you." "No," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It simply revealed what was always there." William drummed his fingers on the desk, a habit he shared with Thomas when thinking through a problem. "And what do you imagine will happen now? That you'll run Willowbrook with your slave doctor by your side? That the other plantation owners will do business with a widow who flouts convention? That I'll simply step aside and let you risk my nephew's inheritance with your reckless decisions?" "I imagine," Eleanor said carefully, "that life at Willowbrook will continue much as before. Isaiah will tend to the health of our workers, ensuring we maintain productivity. I will manage the household as I always have. And you, William, will handle the business affairs as Thomas wished. Nothing need change in the eyes of society." "Except that you've demonstrated an alarming independence," William countered. "Purchasing slaves without consultation, making decisions that affect the plantation's reputation." "I made one decision to save lives, including my own," Eleanor replied. "Hardly a revolution." As she turned to leave, William called after her. "This doesn't change anything, Eleanor. You still can't run Willowbrook alone. One clever maneuver doesn't make you Thomas. Without a husband, your position here remains precarious at best." Eleanor paused at the door, her hand resting on the polished wood. "You're right, William. I'm not Thomas. I may prove to be something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge neither had expected from her lips. As she walked back to her rooms, Eleanor's confident facade crumbled with each step. The purchase had depleted nearly all her personal funds, her only independent resource. The small inheritance from her father that Thomas had allowed her to keep separate from the Montgomery estate was now reduced to a few dollars and some jewelry. And she had just made a powerful enemy in William, a man who controlled the purse strings of Willowbrook and had connections throughout Charleston society. But when she entered her chamber to find Martha waiting with news that Isaiah had arrived safely at Willowbrook, installed in a small cabin near the quarters where he could continue his healing work, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, the quiet satisfaction of having taken control of her own fate, whatever the consequences might be. "He asked me to give you this, Mrs.," Martha said, holding out a small cloth pouch. "Said to brew it as tea for the next 3 days to keep your strength up." Eleanor took the pouch, feeling the dried herbs inside. Such a small thing. this exchange of healing knowledge, yet it represented something profound, a choice she had, made independently, a life she had valued enough to risk her own security. "Thank you, Martha," she said softly. "For everything." Martha nodded, understanding, passing between the two women. "What happens now, Mrs.?" "Now?" Eleanor sighed, sinking into the chair by her window. "Now we prepare for William's retaliation. He won't forgive this easily." "No," Martha agreed, her expression somber. "He won't." What Eleanor couldn't know was that William was already composing a letter to his banking associates in Charleston, a letter that would set in motion events that would threaten everything Eleanor had just fought to protect. In his study, William's pen scratched across paper, forming words that spoke of concern for his brother's widow, her fragile mental state following Thomas's death, and the unfortunate necessity of considering more direct intervention in Willowbrook's affairs. And in the small cabin near the slave quarters, Isaiah unpacked his precious herbs and remedies, wondering if he had escaped one form of bondage only to enter another, more complicated one. The white woman with fire in her eyes had purchased him, saved him from Caldwell's wrath. But to what end? What would this new mistress expect in return for her unprecedented intervention? As the sun climbed higher over Willowbrook Plantation, three people contemplated the same uncertain future from vastly different perspectives, each making plans the others could not begin to imagine. A week passed at Willowbrook, bringing with it the first tentative signs of normalcy. The fever that had ravaged the quarters subsided under Isaiah's care. Field hands returned to work, though many still moved with the lingering weakness of recent illness. In the main house, Eleanor gradually resumed her duties as mistress, her strength returning with each passing day. On the surface, the plantation operated as it always had. But beneath this veneer of routine, currents of change rippled outward from Eleanor's decision. "The other house slaves are afraid of him," Martha reported one morning as she arranged Eleanor's hair. "They cross themselves when he walks by, call him Conjure Man behind his back." "And the field hands?" Eleanor asked, meeting Martha's eyes in the mirror. "Different story entirely," Martha replied, her voice lowering despite the closed door. "They seek him out at night, not just for healing. They listen to him. The way he talks about Africa, about his grandmother's village. It gives them something." "Something?" Martha's hands paused in their work. "Hope, maybe, or memory. Something William would call dangerous." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. William had departed for Charleston 3 days after their confrontation, ostensibly on banking business. His absence should have been a relief, but Eleanor sensed it was merely a tactical retreat. "Has Isaiah settled into his cabin?" "Yes, Mrs., though he asks permission to gather herbs from the woods beyond the north fields." "Tell him he has it," Eleanor decided. "He's to have freedom to collect what he needs for his healing work." Martha's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. "That's generous, Mrs. More freedom than most slaves here have ever known." "He's not most slaves," Eleanor replied simply. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked the grounds for the first time since her illness, ostensibly to inspect the kitchen garden, but with every intention of observing the quarters from a distance. As she rounded the hedge separating the formal gardens from the working areas of the plantation, she nearly collided with Isaiah himself. He stepped back immediately, eyes downcast. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Montgomery." "Isaiah," she acknowledged, suddenly uncertain. This was their first meeting since the night William had discovered them. "How are you finding Willowbrook?" "The people are sickly but improving," he answered carefully. "The water from the new well you ordered dug is clean." "I meant your accommodations," Eleanor clarified. "Are they satisfactory?" Isaiah's eyes lifted briefly to meet hers, then returned to the ground. "Better than Caldwell's, ma'am." The formal distance between them felt strange after the intimacy of the sick room, where he had tended her without ceremony or deference. Eleanor realized with a start that she missed that directness. "You saved my life," she said abruptly. "I never properly thanked you." "You purchased mine," he countered, his voice so low she barely caught the words. "I believe that makes us even." Before Eleanor could respond, the plantation bell rang, signaling the midday meal for the house slaves. Isaiah bowed slightly and turned to go. "Isaiah," she called after him, "if you need anything for your work, you need only ask." He paused without turning. "What I need, Mrs. Montgomery, you cannot give." The words lingered in Eleanor's mind as she continued her walk. What had she expected? Gratitude? Friendship? The boundaries between them were as fixed as the stars. Mistress and slave, white and black, power and powerlessness. Yet something had shifted during those fevered nights when her life hung in the balance. For a brief time, they had been simply healer and patient, two humans connected by the fragile thread of mortality. Eleanor's contemplation was interrupted by the approach of a carriage coming up the main drive, an unexpected visitor. As it drew closer, she recognized the Caldwell family crest on the door and felt a chill of apprehension. Mrs. Caldwell herself descended from the carriage, a frail woman rarely seen beyond the confines of her own plantation or the church pew. Eleanor hurried to greet her, smoothing her skirts and composing her features into a welcoming smile. "Mrs. Caldwell, what an unexpected pleasure." "Mrs. Montgomery," the older woman acknowledged, her pale face grave. "I must speak with you, privately." In the small parlor, reserved for intimate conversations, Mrs. Caldwell declined refreshments and came directly to the point. "I've come to warn you," she said, her voice surprisingly strong for one so physically diminished. "My husband has been in correspondence with your brother-in-law. They believe they're being discreet, but servants hear everything." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What sort of correspondence?" "The kind that concerns your future, my dear, and the future of Willowbrook." Mrs. Caldwell's rheumy eyes held unexpected compassion. "William Montgomery is seeking to have you declared incompetent to manage your affairs. He's gathering testimonies about your erratic behavior following your husband's death." The room seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor. "On what grounds?" "Your illness, which he characterizes as a nervous fever brought on by grief. Your purchase of Isaiah, which he portrays as financially reckless. And—" Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. "Rumors he's carefully cultivating about the nature of your relationship with a male slave." The implication struck Eleanor like a physical blow. "That's absurd. Isaiah saved my life. There was nothing improper." "Truth matters less than perception, as I'm sure you know." Mrs. Caldwell sighed. "My husband has agreed to support William's petition to the courts. In return, William has offered favorable terms on a loan Caldwell desperately needs." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked, studying the older woman's face. "Why betray your husband's confidence?" Mrs. Caldwell's thin lips curved in a bitter smile. "Because 30 years ago, I was you. Young, widowed, determined to maintain independence. I failed. Richard Caldwell was my late husband's business partner. He offered marriage as protection from financial ruin. I had no choice but to accept." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He's been a cruel husband, Eleanor, and William Montgomery reminds me too much of Richard in his younger days. I would spare you my fate if I can." "What can I do?" Eleanor asked, mind racing. "If William has already begun this process—" "You need allies," Mrs. Caldwell interrupted. "Powerful ones, and quickly." She withdrew a sealed letter from her reticule. "This is an introduction to Judge Harrington's wife. She holds considerable influence over her husband, who would hear any petition regarding your competency." Eleanor took the letter, hope flickering. "Why would she help me?" "Because in her youth she was a Montgomery. Your husband's second cousin, I believe. Family connections matter in Charleston, especially old ones." Mrs. Caldwell rose to leave. "Use this wisely, my dear, and remember, a woman alone in our world must be twice as clever and 3 times as careful as any man." After Mrs. Caldwell's departure, Eleanor summoned Martha and Isaiah to her study, a bold move that would have scandalized Charleston society, but time for propriety had passed. "William is moving against me," she explained, outlining Mrs. Caldwell's warning. "If he succeeds in having me declared incompetent, Willowbrook falls under his guardianship until Thomas's son comes of age. And we all fall under his control," Martha added grimly. Isaiah, standing near the door, spoke for the first time. "Including me. And he'll sell me south at the first opportunity." "I won't let that happen," Eleanor declared, "to any of you, but I need to go to Charleston immediately to secure allies before William's petition advances." "Traveling alone would only strengthen his case against you," Martha pointed out. "A respectable widow doesn't journey without proper escort." "Then you'll accompany me," Eleanor decided, "and Isaiah as well." Isaiah's head snapped up in surprise. "Me, Mrs. Montgomery? To Charleston?" "As my husband's widow, I'm entitled to a personal physician," Eleanor explained, the plan forming as she spoke. "Your presence can be justified as medical necessity following my illness." "It's risky," Martha warned. "Charleston isn't the countryside. The restrictions on colored folk are strictly enforced." "Which is why we'll need papers," Eleanor said, moving to Thomas's desk. "Travel documents indicating Isaiah's purpose and permission to accompany me." As she penned the necessary letters, Eleanor felt a strange calm descend. The path ahead was fraught with danger, yet for the first time since Thomas's death, she had purpose beyond mere survival. "We leave at first light," she announced, sealing the documents with the Montgomery crest. "Pack only what's necessary. We must reach Charleston before William realizes we've gone." After Martha and Isaiah departed to prepare, Eleanor remained in the study, her gaze falling on Thomas's portrait above the mantel. His expression seemed different now, less the commanding patriarch, more a man who had never anticipated the challenges his death would bring to those he left behind. "I'm fighting for your legacy," she told the painted face, "though perhaps not in the way you would have chosen." Outside the window, the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Willowbrook's manicured lawns. In the distance, smoke rose from the slave quarters as cooking fires were lit for the evening meal. 2 worlds existing side by side, connected by invisible threads of dependence, exploitation, and occasionally, unexpectedly, something like respect. Tomorrow, Eleanor would risk everything on a desperate journey to secure her future. Tonight, she would prepare for battle with the only weapons available to her: intelligence, determination, and the unlikely alliance she had formed with 2 people society deemed beneath her. As darkness fell over Willowbrook, Eleanor Montgomery made a silent vow. She would return to this place as its rightful mistress, or not at all. Dawn broke over Willowbrook in a wash of pale gold, the early morning light filtering through the mist that clung to the fields like a gossamer veil. Eleanor stood on the front portico, her traveling cloak drawn tight against the morning chill, watching as Jenkins secured the final trunk to the back of the carriage. She had chosen her smallest traveling coach, less conspicuous than the formal Montgomery carriage with its emblazoned family crest and polished brass fittings that announced wealth and position to all who saw it. The decision to travel modestly was deliberate, one of many careful choices she had made in the pre-dawn hours as she prepared for this journey. Her trunks contained only practical garments, morning dresses appropriate for a widow making calls, but nothing ostentatious that might draw undue attention. She had sewn a small pouch of coins into the lining of her cloak and tucked Thomas's miniature portrait against her heart, a talisman of the life she was fighting to preserve. "Everything is ready, Mrs. Montgomery," Jenkins reported, his manner stiff as he approached the steps. The leather of his boots creaked with each movement, the sound unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Eleanor knew he disapproved of this journey, likely suspecting she fled William's authority. But as overseer, he answered to her in William's absence, whatever his personal feelings. "Thank you, Jenkins," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Remember, if anyone inquires, I've gone to visit my cousin in Somerville for a fortnight's rest. No mention of Charleston." "Yes, ma'am." His eyes flicked toward the back entrance where Martha now appeared, her arms laden with last-minute provisions for the journey. Behind her walked Isaiah, carrying a small wooden case that contained his medicines and healing implements. Jenkins' expression darkened, the lines around his mouth deepening with disapproval. "Is it wise to bring him, ma'am? The boy could drive you instead." Eleanor noted the deliberate omission of Isaiah's name, a small but telling slight that revealed Jenkins' resentment of the healer's elevated status since his arrival at Willowbrook. "Isaiah's medical knowledge is why I'm recovering," Eleanor said firmly, meeting Jenkins' gaze without wavering. "I won't risk a relapse without proper care, and the boy lacks experience with the team. These roads can be treacherous after the spring rains." Jenkins knew better than to argue further, though his disapproval radiated from every line of his body as he stepped back to allow Martha and Isaiah to board the carriage. Eleanor caught the meaningful glance he exchanged with the driver, a white man named Simmons who had served the Montgomery family for years. She made a mental note to watch Simmons carefully. His loyalty might lie more with William than with her. The carriage interior had been arranged with careful attention to propriety. The leather seats had been freshly oiled, and Martha had placed cushions to ease the journey's inevitable discomfort. Eleanor would sit facing forward, Martha beside her as befitted a lady's personal maid. Isaiah would occupy the backward-facing seat, maintaining proper distance between himself and the women. To casual observers, they would appear as mistress, lady's maid, and manservant, a perfectly acceptable traveling party for a widow of means. As Eleanor settled into her seat, she felt the weight of the documents secured in the hidden pocket of her dress. Travel papers for Isaiah, letters of introduction, and, most importantly, the sealed note from Mrs. Caldwell to Mrs. Harrington. These papers represented both vulnerability and hope, the fragile foundation upon which her plan rested. "All is secure, Mrs. Montgomery," Simmons called from his perch. "Ready when you are." Eleanor took one last look at Willowbrook's white-columned facade, gleaming in the morning light. The home she had entered as a bride 6 years earlier, where she had expected to live out her days as Thomas Montgomery's wife and the mother of his children. Fate had decreed otherwise, leaving her to fight for a place that was legally hers but practically vulnerable to William's machinations. "Proceed," she instructed, her voice betraying none of the emotion that tightened her throat. The carriage lurched forward, gravel crunching beneath the wheels as they rolled down the long drive lined with live oaks. The ancient trees formed a canopy overhead, their moss-draped branches creating patterns of light and shadow across the carriage windows. Eleanor had always found this avenue beautiful, but today it seemed almost mournful, as if the trees themselves bent in solemn farewell. As the carriage pulled away from Willowbrook, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of trepidation and exhilaration. She had not left the plantation since Thomas's funeral 6 months earlier. The world beyond its boundaries seemed simultaneously threatening and full of possibility. The familiar weight of grief that had become her constant companion since Thomas's death was now joined by a new sensation, a quickening of the pulse, an alertness to danger and opportunity alike. 3 days to Charleston if the roads are good, she remarked, watching the familiar landscape recede through the window. The fields of young cotton plants stretched to the horizon, their tender green leaves catching the morning light. "We'll stop at the Wilkes' plantation tonight. They're old friends of the family who'll ask few questions." Martha nodded, her hands folded primly in her lap, though Eleanor noted how tightly her fingers were clasped, betraying the anxiety beneath her composed exterior. "And if we encounter Master William on the road?" "We won't," Eleanor assured her, though the possibility had haunted her planning. Mrs. Caldwell mentioned he plans to remain in Charleston through month's end. Business with the cotton exchange, apparently. Isaiah sat silently opposite them, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside. This was the first time he had left Caldwell Plantation in 15 years, apart from his clandestine healing visits to neighboring properties. Eleanor wondered what thoughts moved behind his carefully composed expression. Did he feel the same mingled fear and hope that stirred in her own breast? Or was his experience of this journey fundamentally different, shaped by the knowledge that his very presence on this road, in this carriage, placed him in danger? The coach settled into a steady rhythm as they reached the main road, the horses maintaining a brisk pace under Simmons's experienced handling. Inside, the three travelers observed the unspoken protocols of their respective positions, the silence broken only by the creaking of leather and the distant calls of morning birds. "Isaiah," Eleanor said finally, drawing his attention from the window. "I've been meaning to ask about your training. You mentioned your grandmother taught you healing arts." His eyes met hers briefly before returning to the window, as if the passing landscape held some secret code only he could decipher. "Yes, ma'am. She was a healer in our village before being brought to America. She taught my mother, who taught me. Your remedies are unlike anything I've seen Dr. Harwood prescribe," Eleanor observed. "The fever that took so many at Willowbrook barely touched those you treated early." "Different knowledge," Isaiah replied, his voice low but clear. "European doctors believe in bleeding and purging to balance humors. My grandmother taught that illness comes from imbalance, yes, but the cure is in strengthening the body, not weakening it further." "Your knowledge saved many lives during the fever," Eleanor acknowledged, remembering the bitter tea he had made her drink, the cool compresses he had applied to her burning skin when she could no longer recognize those around her. "Including mine." A faint smile touched his lips, transforming his face for a brief moment. "Knowledge is the one thing they can't take from us, Mrs. Montgomery. They can sell our bodies, separate our families, but what's in our minds remains our own." The simple truth of this statement hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt Martha shift uncomfortably beside her, perhaps concerned that Isaiah spoke too freely. But the journey to Charleston had already moved them beyond the familiar boundaries of Willowbrook. Out here, the rules seemed less certain, the rigid hierarchies that governed plantation life slightly loosened by the simple fact of shared confinement within the carriage's intimate space. "In Charleston," Eleanor said after a moment, drawing her thoughts back to the practical concerns that must govern their actions. "We must be especially careful. The city has strict laws governing the movement of colored people. Isaiah, you must keep your papers with you at all times. Never go anywhere alone." "I know Charleston well, Mrs. Montgomery," he replied quietly, his expression growing distant. "I was born there, sold to Caldwell when I was 12. This revelation surprised Eleanor. She had assumed, like most of Willowbrook's slaves, Isaiah had been born into bondage on a plantation. The thought of him as a child in Charleston, perhaps the son of skilled urban slaves, added another dimension to the man sitting across from her. "Your family?" she asked, the question escaping before she could consider its propriety. "Separated. Mother sold to New Orleans. Father died resisting. 2 sisters I haven't seen since childhood." He delivered these facts without emotion, as if reciting events that had happened to someone else entirely. But Eleanor caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the momentary closing of his eyes that betrayed the pain beneath the recitation. Eleanor fell silent, struck by the casual brutality of a system she had benefited from her entire life. What could she possibly say in response to such loss? Her own troubles, real as they were, seemed suddenly small in comparison. She was fighting to maintain her position, her home, her independence. Isaiah was existing in a world that refused to acknowledge his most basic humanity. Martha reached across the carriage to briefly touch Isaiah's hand, a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes about shared experiences Eleanor could never fully comprehend. These two people shared a world of pain and resilience that ran parallel to the white society that had created their bondage. The carriage jolted as it turned onto the main road that would eventually lead them to Charleston, and conversation ceased as they settled into the rhythm of travel. Eleanor withdrew Mrs. Caldwell's letter from her reticule, studying the elegant script that addressed it to Mrs. Harrington. This tenuous connection represented her best hope of countering William's machinations. The morning passed slowly, the landscape gradually changing as they left Willowbrook's immediate vicinity. They passed other plantations, some larger, some smaller, all bearing the unmistakable marks of the peculiar institution that powered the South's economy. Field hands bent over young cotton plants, overseers on horseback watching their progress. Occasionally they passed groups of slaves moving between properties, always accompanied by white men with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Around midday they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek that bubbled cheerfully over smooth stones. The spot was shaded by ancient willows whose branches trailed in the clear water. While Simmons tended to the team, unhitching them to drink and graze, Martha unpacked a simple meal of cold chicken, bread, and early summer peaches that the cook had prepared before dawn. Eleanor stretched her legs, grateful for the respite from the carriage's confines. The day had grown warm, and she removed her traveling cloak, draping it over a fallen log where she sat to eat. Martha spread a small cloth on the ground nearby, arranging their meal with the same care she would have shown in Willowbrook's dining room. They ate in the dappled shade of oak trees, the three of them forming an unlikely tableau that would have scandalized Charleston society. Mistress, maid, and slave healer sharing a meal as if the rigid hierarchies that governed their world had temporarily dissolved. "Tell me about Judge Harrington," Eleanor said, directing her question to both Martha and Isaiah as she bit into a perfectly ripe peach, its juice staining her fingers. "Either of you know anything about the man or his wife?" "Only rumors, Mrs.," Martha replied, carefully wiping her hands on a small cloth. "They say he's fair-minded for a judge, less harsh on colored defendants than most. His wife is known for charity work, runs some sort of society for orphaned children." "The Charleston Ladies' Benevolent Association," Isaiah added, surprising both women with his specific knowledge. "They provide education for orphans and some free-colored children, reading and basic ciphering mostly." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You seem well-informed about Charleston society." Isaiah met her gaze steadily. "When your survival depends on understanding the white world, you learn to listen carefully, Mrs. Montgomery." "He's right about Judge Harrington," Martha confirmed. "Folks say he attends the Methodist church that allows colored worshipers in the balcony, not the Episcopal one where most of the plantation families go." Isaiah nodded in agreement. Caldwell once complained about Harrington ruling against him in a property dispute, called him too soft on principle, said his wife's charitable work had given him dangerous ideas about equality. "That sounds promising," Eleanor mused, wiping peach juice from her lips. "If he's willing to rule against powerful men like Caldwell, perhaps he'll see through William's petition." "If you can reach him before Master William's influence does," Martha cautioned, her practical nature asserting itself. "Money speaks louder than principle for most men, even fair-minded judges." The reminder of urgency hastened their departure. Eleanor watched as Simmons hitched the horses back to the carriage, his movements efficient but unhurried. She wondered again about his loyalties. Would he report this journey to William when they returned? The possibility added another layer of complexity to an already precarious situation. Back on the road, the conversation turned to practical matters. Their approach to Charleston, accommodations, and strategy for contacting Mrs. Harrington without alerting William to their presence. "The Palmetto Hotel on Meeting Street would be suitable," Eleanor suggested. "It's respectable, but not where William would expect me to stay. He knows I prefer the Harbor House when in Charleston." "The Palmetto has quarters for personal servants," Martha added. Isaiah could stay there without attracting notice. "I have a cousin who works in the Harrington household," Isaiah offered unexpectedly, his voice low enough that Simmons couldn't overhear from his perch. "Leah, she's Mrs. Harrington's personal maid." Eleanor turned to him with surprise. "How do you maintain such connections across plantations?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The same way news of your fever reached me at Caldwell Plantation. We have ways of passing messages that white folk rarely notice." The implication was clear. An invisible network existed beneath the surface of Southern society, connecting enslaved people across plantations and households. Eleanor had always vaguely known this but had never considered its implications or extent. How much did the slaves of Willowbrook know about her? About Thomas? About William's plans? "Could you get a message to this Leah?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Before we make a formal approach to Mrs. Harrington." Isaiah considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Possibly. In Charleston, market day brings house slaves from many households together. Messages can be passed then. And there are certain churches where colored folk gather on Sundays." "Then that's our first step," Eleanor decided. "We arrive in Charleston, secure lodgings at the Palmetto, and make contact with Mrs. Harrington through Leah before William discovers our presence." The plan was taking shape, transforming from desperate flight into strategic advance. Eleanor felt a surge of determination. William had underestimated her, assuming grief had rendered her passive and malleable. He would soon discover otherwise. As the day wore on, the carriage passed other travelers on the increasingly busy road, merchants with wagons piled high with goods, farmers bringing produce to market, occasionally another private carriage whose occupants exchanged curious glances with Eleanor. Each encounter heightened her awareness of how vulnerable they were, 3 people challenging the established order in ways both small and profound. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, turning the carriage interior into an oven despite the open windows. Eleanor's dress clung uncomfortably to her skin, and she noticed Martha discreetly dabbing at her forehead with a handkerchief. Isaiah alone seemed unaffected by the heat, his posture as composed as it had been at dawn. "How much farther to the Wilkes plantation?" Eleanor asked as they passed a milestone. "Another hour, I reckon," Martha replied, peering out at the position of the sun. "Should arrive before supper." Eleanor nodded, mentally reviewing what she knew of the Wilkes family. Old Mr. Wilkes had been a contemporary of Thomas's father, one of the few neighbors who had maintained friendly relations with the Montgomerys through the years. His plantation was smaller than Willowbrook, growing primarily tobacco rather than cotton, but well respected in the county. His wife had died years earlier, leaving him in the care of his unmarried daughter, Miss Agatha, a woman of Eleanor's mother's generation known for her sharp tongue and sharper intellect. "The Wilkes have always been kind to me," Eleanor remarked, "but we must be careful what we say. Miss Agatha misses little and gossips much." "Best to stick to your story about visiting your cousin, then," Martha advised. "No hint of Charleston or legal matters." "Agreed," Eleanor said. "And Isaiah, you'll need to—" She was interrupted by a sudden shout from Simmons and a violent lurch of the carriage. Eleanor was thrown forward, barely catching herself against the opposite seat as the vehicle tilted alarmingly to one side. "Damnation!" Simmons cursed from above. "Wheels caught in a rut!" The carriage had come to a precarious halt, listing dangerously toward the right side where the road had been washed out by recent rains. Through the window, Eleanor could see one wheel spinning uselessly above a deep gully. "Is everyone all right?" she asked, straightening herself with as much dignity as possible. Martha nodded, though her hand pressed against her side where she had struck the door. Isaiah was already moving, opening the carriage door on the elevated side. "Stay inside, Mrs. Montgomery," he instructed, his tone more authoritative than Eleanor had ever heard from him. The carriage could shift if the weight changes suddenly. Before she could respond, he had slipped out to assess the situation. Eleanor watched through the window as he and Simmons conferred, the driver's initial hostility giving way to grudging respect as Isaiah pointed out something about the wheel's position. "We need to redistribute the weight," Isaiah's voice carried to the carriage, "and find something to brace that wheel once we lift it." What followed was a tense half-hour of careful maneuvering. Isaiah directed Simmons to unhitch the horses and move certain trunks from one side of the carriage to the other. With Eleanor and Martha remaining perfectly still inside, the men gradually shifted the carriage's balance until they could work logs beneath the suspended wheel. When it was finally safe to exit, Eleanor found Isaiah and Simmons covered in mud but successful in their efforts. The carriage sat level once more, though the damaged wheel would need proper repairs before they continued. "Can it be fixed here?" Eleanor asked, surveying the damage. Simmons shook his head. "Spokes cracked clean through. Need a wheelwright." "The Wilkes plantation is closest," Isaiah observed, pointing down the road. "Less than 5 miles, I'd guess." "We could walk that distance before dark," Eleanor calculated, glancing at the lowering sun. "Walk?" Simmons looked scandalized. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Montgomery, but that wouldn't be proper. You and Martha should wait with the carriage while I ride ahead for help." Eleanor considered this option. It would be the conventional choice, certainly, but it would leave them stranded for hours, possibly overnight, beside the road. "No," she decided. "We'll all proceed to the Wilkes plantation. You can ride one horse, Simmons, and bring back help for the carriage. The rest of us will walk." "Ma'am, I must protest." "Your protest is noted," Eleanor cut him off. "But my decision stands. Martha, Isaiah, gather only what we need for the night. The rest can be retrieved tomorrow when the carriage is repaired." The shock on Simmons's face might have been comical under different circumstances. A lady of Eleanor's standing simply did not walk 5 miles along a country road, especially in the company of slaves. But Eleanor's expression brooked no argument, and soon they were organized for the journey. Simmons mounted on one of the carriage horses, carrying news of their plight ahead, while Eleanor, Martha, and Isaiah followed on foot with small bundles of necessities. The walk itself became an unexpected respite from the carriage's confines. The late afternoon air was cooler now, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Eleanor had removed her impractical shoes, carrying them in one hand while her stockinged feet found surprising pleasure in the packed earth of the road. Martha had hitched up her skirts in a most unladylike fashion, revealing sturdy ankles that moved with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to physical labor. Isaiah walked slightly ahead, carrying the heaviest of their bundles as well as his medical case. Occasionally he would stop to point out a particular plant or herb growing alongside the road, naming its properties and uses with the precision of a natural philosopher. "That one cures warts," he explained, indicating a nondescript weed with tiny yellow flowers. "And the bark of that tree can bring down fevers almost as effectively as cinchona bark from South America." Eleanor found herself fascinated by this impromptu education. How do you know which plants heal and which harm? "Trial and error over generations," Isaiah replied. "My grandmother said our people have been studying the language of plants since the beginning of time. The knowledge came with us across the ocean, and then we learned the new plants here, adding to what we already knew." "You should write it down," Eleanor suggested impulsively. "This knowledge is too valuable to risk losing." Isaiah gave her a long look. "It would be illegal for me to write anything, Mrs. Montgomery. Or have you forgotten that teaching slaves to read and write carries heavy penalties in South Carolina?" The rebuke, gentle as it was, reminded Eleanor sharply of the realities that governed their world. Of course, Isaiah couldn't document his knowledge. The very laws designed to preserve the institution of slavery ensured that valuable learning remained unrecorded, at risk of disappearing with each generation. "I could write it," she offered after a moment. "You could dictate, and I could create a record." The suggestion hung between them, another small subversion of the established order. Martha shot Eleanor a warning glance, but Isaiah's expression had softened slightly. "Perhaps," was all he said, but Eleanor sensed it was not an outright rejection. By late afternoon, the Wilkes plantation came into view, a modest estate compared to Willowbrook but well-maintained, with fields of tobacco stretching green and lush on either side of the drive. The main house was smaller than the Montgomery residence, built in an older style with a wide, wraparound porch rather than formal columns. Simmons had clearly arrived ahead of them, for they could see activity around the house, servants moving purposefully, and on the porch, the tall, angular figure of Miss Agatha Wilkes peering down the drive in their direction. Eleanor straightened her travel-rumpled dress and attempted to tidy her hair, which had partly escaped its pins during the walk. "Remember," she instructed, "we're simply breaking our journey to visit my cousin. No mention of Charleston or William." Martha nodded, helping Eleanor restore some semblance of propriety to her appearance. Isaiah fell back several paces, resuming the proper distance between slave and mistress as they approached civilization once more. As they neared the house, Eleanor could see old Mr. Wilkes had joined his daughter on the porch, supported by his ever-present cane. His weathered face broke into a smile of genuine pleasure at the sight of her. "Mrs. Montgomery," he called in greeting, his voice still strong despite his advanced years. "What an adventure you've had. How delightful to see Thomas's bride again, though I wish it were under less dusty circumstances." "Mr. Wilkes," Eleanor replied, summoning a warm smile as she climbed the porch steps. "Miss Agatha, your hospitality is most appreciated in my time of distress." "Nonsense," Miss Agatha declared, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Eleanor's disheveled state. "We couldn't very well leave you stranded on the road. Though I must say, Eleanor, walking 5 miles is hardly the behavior one expects from a Montgomery widow. What would dear Thomas say?" The question, pointed as it was, contained no real malice. Miss Agatha's acerbic manner was legendary in the county, but her heart was generally acknowledged to be in the right place. "Thomas would say I've always been stubborn as a mule," Eleanor replied with a small laugh, "and that waiting helplessly was never my strong suit." This answer seemed to satisfy Miss Agatha, who nodded approvingly. "Well said. Now, come inside and get cleaned up. Supper will be ready shortly, and you can tell us all about this journey to visit your cousin. Somerville, wasn't it? Curious time of year for a social call." The shrewd observation reminded Eleanor that Miss Agatha missed very little. This evening would require careful navigation indeed. Behind her, Martha and Isaiah were being directed to the servants' quarters by the Wilkes butler, a dignified older man who had served the family for decades. Their eyes met briefly across the lawn, a silent acknowledgment of the charade they must maintain and the stakes that made it necessary. "A bath has been prepared for you upstairs," Miss Agatha informed Eleanor, taking her arm in a surprisingly strong grip. "Your maid can attend you once she's settled, and your man can see to the repairs of your carriage tomorrow. Our blacksmith will assist." "Thank you," Eleanor said sincerely. "Your kindness is a blessing after a trying day." As she allowed herself to be led inside the Wilkes home, Eleanor's mind was already working through the evening ahead, the questions she would need to deflect, the half-truths she would tell, the careful balance she must maintain between gratitude and guardedness. For tonight, they would play their assigned roles. Tomorrow, they would continue toward Charleston and the confrontation that awaited. The first steps of their journey had been taken. There was no turning back now. The Wilkes home welcomed her with the familiar comforts of Southern hospitality. Cool hallways scented with beeswax and lemon oil, the distant sounds of dinner preparations from the kitchen, the gentle murmur of a household running smoothly under experienced management. As Miss Agatha led her toward the stairs, Eleanor caught sight of herself in a hallway mirror, hair escaping its pins, face flushed from the walk, eyes bright with purpose rather than dulled by grief. She barely recognized the woman who looked back at her,